Hi, I'm Becca, and today I'm going to show you how you would make a branched experiment in PsychoPy. So what is a branched experiment? Well, in its most basic form, this just means something where the direction your experiment takes depends on some kind of response that's made earlier on. So perhaps the most basic example of a branched experiment could be if your participant agrees to take part at the beginning of the task. So let's imagine we are presenting a consent screen where your participant has two options, yes or no. If they say yes, then they will see your task. If they say no, then they'll be shown a different message that says, thank you for considering our study, goodbye. So what we're going to do is, first of all, I have just opened up a very basic PsychoPy experiment. It's got nothing in it yet. And we are just going to make up what would be our basic trial. So I'm just going to add some stimuli. I'm just going to say, this is where our experiment would happen. Okay, lovely stuff. So we've got our basic trial. Of course, most experiments are more complicated than this. But let's imagine this is our experiment. I'm then going to insert a routine, and I'm going to call this here consent. And I'm going to add that to the start of my flow because that's where we would be most likely to ask someone for their consent, I hope, at the very start of our experiment. And I'm going to click on that, and I'm going to add some text here, and I'm going to say, do you agree to take part? And let's say, press the Y key for yes, press the N key for no. And I'm going to let this text present on screen infinitely, so until the participant makes their decision. So we make that duration field blank, and I'm going to call it consent text, making sure there's no spaces in that name of this component. Okay, so the participant's going to see a question, and then they're just going to be asked, press the yes key if you agree to take part, press the N key if you do not agree to take part. Okay, so if the participant does, well, actually, first of all, we need a keyboard component so they can make their response. So we are going to scrolly down to responses, click on keyboard, and I am only going to allow the Y and N keys here. And I'm going to call this consent resp. Lovely. Okay, so we know if the participant presses the Y key, we want them to be presented with our trial or our set of trials. If they press the N key, what do we want to show them? Well, we probably want to show them a slightly different message, something that says, thanks for considering our study. So let's add a routine to present that message. So we're going to go insert routine, and let's say this is called no consent message. I'm going to add that to the end here, and within this routine, I'm just going to add that text that says, thanks for considering our study, goodbye. I'll call this bye text. Lovely. Okay, so in this first routine here, if they press Y, we want them to see what is presented here. If they press N, we want them to be presented with this no consent message. So what I'm going to do, first of all, is I'm going to wrap a loop around my trial. I will come back to that one in a moment. And I'm going to wrap a loop around my no consent message, and I'll come back to that one in a moment. Now, in reality, actually, we'd probably present a set of trials. So you'd probably already have a loop around your trial routine. So I'm just going to wrap another loop around that. And I'm going to call this show trials loop. Okay. And I will deselect this is trials option because this loop that I'm adding now, each iteration of that loop isn't going to correspond to a trial. and I will tell you why. So the purpose of this loop here, this show trials loop, and the purpose of this loop here, this loop that now I'm going to call it show consent message loop, which I'm also going to deselect this is trials option. The only purpose of these loops here is to decide whether the content of this loop is presented or not. So what I could do, sneaky little tip in PsychoPy, is if I was to set n reps in any of my loops to be 0, that would skip everything that is inside this loop. Now what that means is that I can use this as a building block to make myself a branched experiment. Because if I was to have n reps of this loop be 0, then my participant would not see any of my trials and they would go on and see my no consent message. Or if I was to have the n reps of this loop to be 0, then my participants would not see this thanks for considering our study message. Now I want this to be conditional based on my participants' response in that initial consent routine. So what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add a code component. Now to find a code component, if you're not familiar with coding, don't panic too much. This is going to be a very brief, short bit of Python here. You can find this code component under custom, and then it's here, it's this little double-headed arrow with a slash through it, and here we have ourselves our code component. Now I will talk through the various elements of this code component in another video. For now, all that's important is we are wanting to use the response that is made inside this routine to determine what's going to happen later on. Now, of course, we don't know what response has been made in this routine until the end of the routine. So for that reason, the piece of code that we're going to add is going to be in this end routine tab. Okay, so all we're going to have here is we're going to say, and I'm going to actually zoom in case you can't see this. Zoom, zoom, zoom. I'm going to say if consent_resp.keys. Now this is just a value that corresponds to the keys that have been pressed by my consent resp component. So that is the name of my keyboard component. So I'm going to say if consent resp.keys equals yes, then I'm going to have a variable called, let's call it trial reps equals 1. And let's say no consent message reps, perhaps I could do something a bit catchier there actually, sorry, equals 0. Let me zoom back out a bit so you can see all of that, lovely. So what I would do then is I'd say, okay, so the Y key has been pressed, so I now have a variable that corresponds to 1 and another variable that corresponds to 0. So I'm just going to use these variables inside my two loops. So I'm going to use trial reps. I'm going to go to the show trials loop and I'm going to use that in the n reps field. And then I am going to do the same for my no consent reps. I'm going to take this other variable and pop it inside this loop. Splendid. Now all I want to do is do exactly the same thing, but I want to do the opposite for if my participant presses the N key. So I'm going to do, be lazy here, I'm going to copy and paste this. Actually going to turn this if statement into an elif statement because I'm checking, well, if the Y key hasn't been pressed, has the N key been pressed? So I'm going to want to change this Y to be N, and then all I'm going to do is say if my participant has pressed the N key, then trial reps is going to be 0. We don't want to present any trials. But no consent message reps is going to be 1 because we do want to present that message that says no, we do, thank you for taking part, goodbye. Okay, so hopefully that should be enough to make ourselves our branched experiment. I'm just going to double check in my trial. So my trials will probably last 5 seconds at the moment because I've got 5 repetitions of this 1 second thing. Maybe I'm just going to add myself a little fixation point so I can see when, when I transition between trials. So I'll call this actually fixation. I'll have this start at 0.5 instead, and it's going to actually only last 0.5 seconds itself. Okay, and then I'm going to do one last thing. The only reason I'm doing this is so that you can see what I'm about to see. You don't need to do this at all. I'm just changing the screen that I'm presenting on so that you will see my experiment. So I'm going to press run. And then, there we go. My experiment is launching. Hopefully I will see a consent screen. Do you agree to take part? I'm going to say yes, I do agree to take part to begin with. So here we go. I am shown 5 trials. Lovely stuff. Now I'm going to try again, but this time I'm going to say no. This time I do not really fancy taking part in this study. Thank you very much. So I'll wait for my little thing to pop up. I will say no. And now I see thanks for considering our study. Goodbye. Okay, so that's a very quick pit stop tour as to how you can make a branched experiment in PsychoPy using very little amounts of code. In this case, we use this to present a set of trials or present a message saying, thank you, goodbye. But you could, in theory, use this to develop other kinds of designs. Perhaps you have 2 types of trial and you want to present one group of participants with one type of trial and one group of participants with another type of trial, depending on the response that they made previously. Now, this type of code would be used to create that kind of a design as well. So hopefully you found this helpful as a very quick PsychoPy tidbit. Thanks for joining me, and hopefully I'll talk to you in other tutorials. Bye.